All right, so shall we get on with it? I am so excited to welcome Jhumpa Lahiri here. She's on our Writers Council, as well as Ann Goldstein, Jenny McPhee, and Michael Moore. They're on our Translators Council, which we don't have yet, but if we did, they would be the first people we asked. So I want to get right to it, so please welcome them to the stage.
Good evening. Buonasera a tutti. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to, first of all, thank the Center for Fiction for hosting this event. This is the first time I've stepped into this beautiful space. I used to live about a minute away. I used to bring my daughter to dance at Mark Morris next door. We've since left this neighborhood, but a piece of me and my family remains very much rooted to Fort Greene, and it's so amazing to see this place dedicated to literature around the corner. It makes me very happy. I would also like to thank Jenny McPhee, Michael Moore, and Goldstein for being here with me tonight. I sort of dreamed that this would happen, and it's happening. When I was in the process of talking with my editor at Penguin Classics about the team of translators who would work on this volume with me, I specifically requested the participation of these three extraordinary translators whose work I deeply admire. I am the youngest translator of the group in terms of my experience. Each of them has taught me so much about what it means to translate from Italian into English. They are also they happen to all be my friends, so it really makes for a wonderful experience. We're going to just have our plan is to have a very fluid conversation among the four of us, and then we'll leave some time for questions from you. So I'll just talk very briefly about why this book exists, why it came to be, how it came to be, and a little bit about what it's about. And then I'll ask each of the translators to speak a little bit, and then we'll sort of get in gear with our conversation. So this is a book of 40 short stories by Italian writers, largely of the 20th century. A few were born just before the 20th century, a few died at the beginning of the 21st century. But it really is a portrait, in that sense, of the 20th century, of Italy in the 20th century, of its history, of its changing identity as a country, as its growing identity, I should say, as a country, and as it solidifies also linguistically. It's a book that grows out of new identities for myself. It grows out of my new life as first and foremost as a teacher, as a professor of creative writing at Princeton. It's a book that grows out of literally the first creative writing class I taught at Princeton 4 years ago, when I first came back from 3 years living in Rome. I was a bit lost. I was bewildered. I was very homesick for a city I had begun to call home. And so in an effort to transition back into life in the United States, I decided to teach a series of Italian writers to my writing students as models of beautiful, exemplary writing. And this was really the beginning of this book. That was the beginning of this book. I hunted around for translations in English because I was teaching a class in English to readers who were reading in English. And the effort of doing that, of going to the library, of looking up this author, that author, authors perhaps that I had come to know and read and admire in Italian, looking for them in English versions. I realized that some did not exist in English, or there were translations that felt dated to me, that I was worried, that I worried that the students wouldn't connect with those translations. There was a lot of photocopying involved, and I sort of wanted, by the end of that year, I wanted this book. I wanted this book to exist. I wanted to be able to have a volume of short stories by Italian authors that I had come to know and love and admire and learn from for myself, to share with my students. Fortuitously, Penguin Classics in the United Kingdom contacted me. I got an email from my agent, Eric Simonoff, who's here with me today, saying, "Do you want to do this?" And I said, "Are you kidding?" Because I had already been dreaming up this book in my head, so much so that in March of my first year back at Princeton, I was back in Rome for my spring break, and I was talking to a dear friend of mine, and I sort of talk about this in the introduction to the anthology, so you can sort of read the longer version. But I was at the home of a writer friend of mine, Caterina Bonvicini, and I said, Caterina, I really want this book. I want to make this book. Who do you think I should put in it? And Caterina has a beautiful apartment with, books to the ceiling, sort of like this. And I remember after that dinner, we just went into her study and we started pulling books off the shelves. And I said, well, I would definitely want, these authors. And then she said, oh, but you have to also put in these. And she was suggesting names I didn't know, authors I hadn't discovered yet. And I made a little list in my agenda of authors that she and I came up with that night as potential authors, were this hypothetical anthology ever to come to be. And literally 2 months after that conversation, I got the email from Eric saying, Penguin is looking for someone to edit a volume of Italian short stories. Do you want to do this? I said, yes. So that was the starting point of this project. As I said, it contains 40 short stories. Why 40? My editor suggested that was the right number. I thought maybe 50, maybe more. There was no dearth of possibilities, but we decided on a number, 40. So I had one set of instructions, and then I decided to exclude living authors. In the beginning, I was also thinking maybe come right up to the present day, but then I thought I'm going to try to focus on authors that are no longer living, and given that, to focus specifically on authors, as many as I could, sort of make a mix of authors who are so great, and because of their greatness, have crossed the border to English, into other languages, and have become part of the greater literary conversation. Authors like Calvino, like Primo Levi, like Natalia Ginsburg, and so on. And alongside them, because these were authors who had become so important to me in my own journey of reading and writing in Italian. So alongside these names and authors who had crossed the border, as it were, I also wanted to include as many authors as I could who hadn't, who remained largely known only within Italy, not translated into English, or very sporadically, or hadn't really broken through that barrier of language. And so this was very important to me. In stepping back from my selection, once it was made, once I started actually putting the pieces of the anthology together, putting the 40 authors in conversation with each other, um, I began to recognize some things that were connecting them. I was struck by these elements. One was certainly the idea of hybridity. These authors, almost all of them, were incredibly complex individuals and complex artists. Complex in the sense that they wrote prose, they wrote poetry, they had different careers. They were writers, but they were also scientists or diplomats, or what have you. They had this sort of double perspective on so many things. They were authors who were themselves so often translators. This was fascinating to me, to discover that almost all of the authors in this volume were active translators, passionate translators of work of so many authors from so many languages, from American authors, French authors, German authors, Russian authors, just an incredible range. So just the range of languages that they knew, that they bring to the table, is really extraordinary. Um, this is because I focus on the 20th century. This book can also be regarded in some sense as a broad commentary on the experience of Italy going through the two world wars, and the rise of fascism and the collapse of it, and all of the effects there, contained in that trajectory. Many of these authors were most active in the period right after World War II, an extraordinary period in Italian literary history. Saw an incredible proliferation of literary magazines, newspapers that were publishing short stories. These publications gave these authors an opportunity to publish short stories, many in an incredibly experimental vein. I was struck by that element in these stories, just the breadth of the type of stories I was discovering, whether I was reading them in Firestone Library in Princeton or in my apartment back in Rome when I was going back. I was struck by how elastic, how malleable the short story form is and was for these authors. They just did whatever they needed to with the short story form. This is a collection that, in some sense, does have a bit of an inclination toward the south of Italy. For those of you who know something about Italian history, literature, culture, the idea is that Italian literature starts sort of from the north with Dante and the Tuscan dialect and so on, and that's a sort of a way of looking at it, right? And I sort of tried to turn this around and to start with a Sicilian writer. There are 5 Sicilian writers actually in this collection. 5 out of the 40 are Sicilian, and there are many writers who were based in Rome, from Naples, from Sardinia, etc. So there is a sort of southern tilt, if you will, to the anthology. The last thing I will say is that I think the core of this entire anthology is the idea of identity. So many of the stories speak of that, whether it's female identity, whether it's identity in general, whether it's speaking of the identity of Italy after World War II, for example. They are very personal stories, each of them. So there's this very intense awareness of the self and what it means to be. It really questions, it interrogates the idea of what it means to be a human being. There's a very interesting component in this anthology. There are a lot of animals. I was very struck by this. I think this was the most surprising element for me, to discover just how many stories were about animals, had animals as protagonists, had couplings between human beings and animals, just privileged the animal. And I talk about this a little bit in my introduction, but this is another sort of central element of the collection. So that's a bit about the project, big picture things. What I'd like to do now is just ask each of these translators a question to get us into conversation. I was going to start with you, Jenny, right?
Yeah.
So Jenny probably translated more stories than anybody. So in addition to Anne, Jenny, and Michael, there were other translators involved, because 17 of the stories have never been translated into English before. And the others, I either incorporated previously existing translations, or in the case of a few, for example, one of the stories Jenny translated, it was a story that had been translated into English, but I felt that the story needed to be revisited in English. And this was the case with the story Jenny translated by Anna Banti. In addition to Anna Banti, Jenny also translated a story by Cristina Campo, by Fausta Cialente, by Massimo Bontempelli. These were stories she translated specifically because I asked her to. And then I also used a story by Anna Maria Ortese, which Anne and Jenny had collaboratively translated previously, and a story finally by Primo Levi, Quaesio de Centauris, which incidentally I just read aloud for a podcast for the New Yorker today. In Jenny's translation.
I never know how to pronounce that, so I'm really glad to hear.
I'm just going to take, with my rusty Latin, I'm going to take a stab at that version. In any case, Jenny, I'd like to ask you two things, actually. One, I gave you the challenge of retranslating something that was already available, and I could have used that version, a previous version of Anna Banti's story. What was that like, to approach that kind of translation, that retranslation? How did you go about it? Did you consult the previous version or not? And also, I think you translated 3 women, and also, 4 counting Ortese, but at my request, you translated 3 women authors, 2 of whom are really hardly talked about even within Italy. These would be Cristina Campo and Fausta Cialente. They're more, one of them has been largely forgotten in the case of Fausta Cialente, and the other one is really more of a rarefied, sort of a writer's writer. She was introduced to me by a good writer friend of mine. So could you speak a little bit about these women, and were they discoveries for you as well?
Sure. First, I'm just really thrilled to be here at the Center Fiction. It is the first time, and it's absolutely stunning place to be, and I'm thrilled to learn that I am on a Translators Council. Thank you. I also want to thank Jhumpa for having me be a part of this. It was she was thrilled to get her email from Penguin. I was thrilled to get her email saying, will you participate in this? Because it was just so exciting to be a part of such a project. Jhumpa, you don't quite remember when there was a selection, and you said, is there anything that you'd like to do? And I said, yes, give me the women.
The women, yes, I do remember that.
So I was really thrilled to also then be able to translate these women. However, it's true, I didn't know, I'd never heard of 2 of them. Mm-hmm. And so that was really interesting to me. And each of them is writing from they're vastly different, but they are writing from a feminist point of view, and from a woman's experience and what it was like to be a woman in Italy at their time and their place, in very different imaginative ways. But that was so revealing to me, and just spoke to how their voices are all contributing to the conversation that's happening in this book, which is just amazing how they're all the stories speak to each other. and the women's voices are just as strong and really forceful in insisting on their place in the history of Italian literature. So it's just great. And then to speak to Anabanti and retranslating, I am very used to retranslating. Once upon a time I said to somebody, to Anne, I was having a difficulty with translating a living author who was asking me to retranslate everything I did. So she thought she spoke English better than I did. And it was a very difficult thing. And Anne was saying, how is that translation going? And I said to her, I'm done with living authors, dead authors from now on. So I have actually been in the business of retranslating dead authors recently. And so retranslation is something that I'm used to. I actually find it interesting at certain points to look at what the translator did before, because in translation, at least for me, it's a conversation not only with the author, but with previous translators, readers, the influences. Jhumpa was saying so many of these authors are translators themselves, and I think just about every one of them is. But what's really interesting is how the influences. So when you read these stories, you are actually seeing how Natalia Ginzburg is influenced by Proust, who she translated, or the infinite examples in here. So it's just this really big conversation. So I do like to include looking back at previous translations, but then as translators, you guys know, it can also be a really hard thing to do, because then their voice, the previous translator's voice, is getting into your head. So it's sort of a little dance there about that.
Mm-hmm. I think what Jenny says about sort of seeing how when authors translate other authors, when authors also translate. So in the case of Natalia Ginzburg, who translates Proust, and you see how the Proust is playing out in her own work. Or in the case of Vittorini, you see how his reading of Hemingway, his translation of Steinbeck, is playing out in his own work. This was a sort of, this became a preoccupation of mine in terms of, sort of really getting to the bottom of these stories. I translated a story by Carlo Cassola. He was a great lover of James Joyce. And so when I read the story, I immediately thought back to my own reading of stories in Dubliners, and sort of read him reading Joyce, and then used my own reading of Joyce to translate Cassola. So in some sense, it's wonderful when writers translate, because you have a whole other backstage access to what they read and what they absorbed on such a visceral level. The other thing I wanted to comment on, Jenny, with what you said, it's true that I did try to make as much room as possible for women in this anthology, and in the end there are 13, 11, one of those numbers. But the interesting thing, having said that, and it's not just 2020 equal, it just isn't. But what is interesting is that so many of the stories, even when written by men, are from the point of view of women. And both Anne and Michael translated stories written by men from the point of view of a woman. I wonder, Michael, if you could speak to that idea. You translated a story. So Michael translated. Michael. First of all, I requested specifically that Michael translate the story by Alberto Moravia, because Michael has already translated a novella by Moravia, an extraordinary work called Agostino, which I read in Michael's translation and deeply admire. I love the novella and I love Michael's translation. I actually taught Michael's translation in that first class I taught at Princeton. So I knew there had to be a story by Moravia in the collection, because maybe I haven't made this clear, but in some sense, this is my, I mean, I wanted to put in the writers who were speaking to me most deeply in that moment. And in that sense, this is also a sort of self-portrait of me, this book, because I'm sort of choosing the authors that are speaking to me. So Moravia there was no question that there would be a story by Moravia, an author, the first Italian author, literally, I sort of managed to read in my life. So I asked Michael to translate a story by Moravia from a very, from a collection that really nobody knows about. Even half my Italian friends have never even come across this collection. So he translated a story by Moravia told from the point of view of a woman.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about that, and also perhaps talk about the experience of translating an author you had already had some experience translating and knowing his voice?
Yeah, first of all, after you've translated an author, to then go on, as translators who've done different authors, we're constantly sort of having to readjust to another tone of voice, another style of Italian. Something might be more precious, something might be more colloquial. And here you have just become familiar with this one voice, and then you're moving on to something else. So it is, and especially if you're doing, Agostino, which I did, was a novella, so only about 100 perfect pages, really, and then you sort of have to let it go and then move on to something else. So it was very nice to go back to Moravia. It was also very nice, I have to say, to do short stories for me. I've been working on a long novel forever. And, and my ideal of writing really is for it to be on a single breath. And the idea of the short story for me, whether or not that actually happens, but to sit down and in a single sitting, do the whole translation, do the story, maybe go back and revise, but for it to have that kind of freshness. Moravia was one of the most prolific writers in 20th century Italy and really dominated the literary scene from the 1940s on. Well, I mean, a huge success with his first novel, The Indifferent Ones. Oh, someone's. I thought that was my mic. But your car has arrived, I thought it said. But but basically, he had also suffered from the Jewish laws in Italy, and by the time he wrote Agostino, and of all times, he wrote it in 1942, I think, and of all the awful times to be a Jew in Italy, and couldn't even publish under his own name at that point. Basically, his livelihood was taken away from him. It's funny, once upon a time, Elsa Morante, who Anne has just so brilliantly translated, was known as the wife of Alberto Moravia, and now Moravia is sort of known as the husband of Elsa Morante.
And I noticed in the anthology, they're next to each other.
Yes, the anthology is in alphabetical order from back to front, so starting with V and ending with A, but Morante and Moravia are,
For better or for worse.
for better or for worse, united.
But the Moravia, and I just actually started to translate the Roman stories yesterday, so I just needed something fresh, and I wanted to do more Moravia, but this sort of came at just the right time. And it was such a surprise because the Agostino is all about adolescent angst in a way, about sex, about this sort of coming of age, and it sort of reminded me of what we used to look to foreign cinema for, which was sex, And there was the earlier translation of it, which was a bit prudish and sort of really afraid to get into the grittiness of what was being talked about. And there was very, very detailed descriptions of the male body. And I wouldn't say, but the prose instead was very brutal. And this instead was just as light as air. It was a woman's sort of fantasy of becoming a kind of gangster's moll, She gets involved with this criminal, and suddenly that's going to lift her up from this sort of humdrum life she has working in a bank. So it was completely surprising. First, when you think of Moravia, you do think of this. He's not macho, but he is presenting the Italian male ego on stage, for Italy. In a sense, it became, I think, overwhelming probably by the 80s and the 90s. It was almost too much. And it was really great just to see this other side to him, and to see the extent to which he empathized with this one character. And I don't want to give away the ending of the story, but it's completely surprising. It's completely funny. And again, Moravia is the last author that you think of as being funny. So that was another side. He is someone that led, I don't want to call it a charmed life, but it is the kind of writer's life that I often dream of, where you get up in the morning and there's your breakfast all served, and then you write, uninterrupted until lunch, and you have lunch. Then he would go to the movies, write a review, see his friends for dinner, go to bed, and then start all over again the next day.
Yeah.
And I think that, what was also beautiful about the story is that it had that sort of lightness of touch that is sometimes not so apparent in all of his writing.
Thank you. Yeah. What you say about Moravia, of course, not being able to publish under his own name is something that Natalia Ginsburg also faces at the beginning of her writing life. We have many writers here who were Jewish, who were forced to be itinerant and adopt pseudonyms in order to publish their work. The theme of pseudonyms is very strong in this collection. It's another thing along with the animals. Once I stepped back to see sort of the ingredients I'd assembled, and I was sort of making a little index cards of all the authors, I realized, wow, so many of them had written under false names, whether because of their Jewish identity and they needed to for their protection, or because they wanted to sever ties with their origins, with their family, with their husband. In the case of Anna Banti, she happened to be married to Roberto Longhi, a very celebrated, famous art historian in Italy. She didn't want to be associated with his name. She didn't want to be associated with her given family name. She chose her own name. So this theme, this fact actually is running through the authors themselves in terms of their own identity. Anne, you have translated among your many subjects, authors you've translated. You're the translator of Elena Ferrante, which is of course a pseudonym, and Ferrante has become in this moment, shall we say, the most well-known Italian author to migrate into English in this moment, and is now in a sort of, category with authors like Eco, Calvino, Primo Levi, in terms of just how clearly and strongly they have traveled across the language barrier into English and to other languages. I, on the other hand, asked you to translate two of the more obscure writers in this list. One was Antonio Delfini. I had never heard of him, and he came to the collection quite late. It took me about a year and a half just to figure out who was going to be in this collection. And Delfini was a last-minute add-in. I was at a dinner in Rome with my dear friend, the poet Patrizia Cavalli, who's actually just written an amazing book of short fiction herself. She, like these authors, a beautiful example of the hybrid identity that to me seems so Italian, so representative of Italian literary production. In any case, and I was at this dinner with her, and she said, "Well, who's in this book of yours?" And I said, "Well, and I pulled out my list because I used to carry it with me in my purse, basically, wherever I went, and I kept asking people, "What do you think? What do you think?" And she said, "Well, you have to put in Delfini. He is the best short story writer." And so then I went back to Princeton, and I went to the library, and I thought, she's right. He's amazing. So I asked you to translate Delfini, and I also asked you to translate a story by Luciano Bianciardi, who is also, people know who he is, but he's not one of those authors who are really very read anymore, and a lot of these authors are hard to come by in bookstores, and I had to do a lot of special ordering, and I also faced a lot of, we can't get this book for you. go to, a secondhand site or a secondhand bookshop or the flea markets or ask a friend if they have the book on their bookshelves. And a lot of the authors in this book are in that category, fall into that category of authors who have sort of fallen off the map, fallen off the radar, important authors in their moment, but just in the shuffle of time have receded. What was it like for you to translate these lesser-known authors, even within the Italian context? Were they surprises for you as well? And my second question is for you, just sort of now that you've contributed your part to this volume, and then what was it like to receive the whole and see sort of how everything was fitting together, or whether you think things fit together?
Well, first of all, I was surprised. I didn't know either of these authors myself, and I found that people, as you say, nobody knew Delfini. A lot of people I knew had heard of Bianciardi.
I knew Delfini.
But you're particular.
I love the, Il Ricordo della Basca. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I've never heard of them.
Yeah.
No, I had never heard of them, and of course, one of the great things about translating short stories is that you get a quick glimpse of many different writers, or in my case, two different writers, but still, it's so interesting because it's just, you don't have to deal with the whole novel of a writer that you don't know, but you just get the idea. I mean, Delfini was difficult, I think, because it's very condensed, very tight, and working out what he was really saying was not always easy. But the funny thing is that both of these stories were sort of about sex, and I thought that was interesting. The Bianciardi is about a guy who's trying to find a prostitute after the brothels have become illegal. I guess 58, whenever that Merlin law was. The brothels became illegal, so there were no brothels, and what were men to do? And it's sort of written in this kind of ironic tone of voice. This guy's just sort of going all over Milan. They were both northern authors also.
Yes.
Yeah.
From Delfini is from Modena and Bianciardi is from Milan. But it's funny. I mean, it's a funny. He's got a sort of funny, ironic, detached attitude, but he really wants to have sex. So it's a really interesting story. I thought it was interesting, and I assume, obviously was written in '61, I think. Representative of Italy at that time. I mean, it represents a social scene, I guess, or social. But Delfini is very different, and as you said, it's from the point of view of a woman. Although in a way, the Bianciardi also, because he talks about all these different women, including his wife. It is very much about women, and Delfini is from the point of view of a woman who has this affair with this man who just suddenly leaves. She's a milliner, she makes hats, but it's quite a wonderful story. I mean,
I was thinking as you were saying that the big difference between Delfini and Bianciardi is one is from the city, from Milano, and the thing about Delfini, he's from Modena, from this provincial city where everyone knows your business, and I think it really affects and that's one of the great things about him as a writer also. It's sort of, I once heard it described as sort of the theology of provincial life in a way,
Yeah, you could see that, because it's all about people looking at each other, people looking through the window of the millinery shop, looking out of the window, sitting in the what's going on with this woman. I thought it was a sort of astonishingly depressing story, actually. But other people didn't think so. But anyway, it was a great experience, really. Both of those stories that were so different.
That story, the Bianciardi story, I know when we looked at it and translated, and then I sort of gave her some. I read it. I gave her some feedback, and one of the things that struck me in reading that story was all of the sexual terminology very technical
Technical
terminology.
things? Yeah.
And it's interesting because there are 3 stories in this collection that come to mind. One of them is the one I read today for the podcast, the Levy story, which is also
hard.
which is also it contains so much sort of, because Levy is the story's about a centaur, and there's actually a story about a young man's relationship with a centaur that lives with their family. But the beginning of the story, the opening of the story, is really sort of playing with scientific language and talking about the theory of origins and the origin of centaurs, sort of in a sort of almost Ovidian way, or biblical, sort of playing with all sorts of creation myths, but scientific language. And then the story by Calvino that I translated with my students at Princeton, actually, in a very special translation workshop that I taught. I translated it with 5 of my students and my co-teacher, Sara Teardo, who's in the Italian department. That story as well, which is an excerpt, sort of a chapter of the novel Palomar, which ended up not becoming part of that novel, a sort of extract, outtake, right, is the word. That story too has this incredibly scientific language about minerals, about elements. So it's interesting that 3 authors in this collection would play with sort of conventional storytelling and other types of sort of informational writing. I don't know if that's the right term, but I wonder if this is a moment to sort of talk more broadly about language in these stories, and what were the challenges for you in terms of working with these authors. I mean, I can say of the authors I translated, apart from Calvino, I translated stories by, as I said, Carlo Cassola, Fabrizia Ramondino, Lalla Romano, Parise, Goffredo Parise, and who is the 5th one? Did I say Alvaro? In any case, Corrado Alvaro, who's the last author, alphabetically, beginning with A at the end. I found his language certainly to be the most challenging for me. Alvaro was a poet, his language, and a fiction writer of stories, novels. His writing was incredibly rich, poetic, full of imagery, full of sort of classical imagery, complex classical imagery, the kind of imagery you find in Homer, in Virgil. He's using this kind of language. So I found him the trickiest personally, and his was the translation I was sort of, even at the last minute, even when the book was in galleys, I kept changing things, changing words, thinking this is not the right word, this is not the right adjective, I haven't hit it right. I wonder who was the most challenging author of the authors that I gave you to translate, and for what reason, and in terms of the language, who was the most challenging?
I would say Delphine definitely was much more challenging than Charlie. Not that everything isn't challenging.
Yes, but in its own way.
But because of this kind of dense quality of the prose, and the fact that the paragraphs were so long. Remember, we made new paragraphs.
That's right. We did. We did some. We took some action. There was some intervening from the translation.
But also because it was hard to understand. The things that happen in this story are so strange, and so when something it's not familiar, like the main character, the milliner, has I forget if it's her cousin. She goes to the city, and they go to some kind of strange parties where basically their men are picking up women, or women are trying to make money from being prostitutes. But they're parties, and the descriptions are so peculiar that it was hard to know if you were really, is this really what he's saying? So it was with fake painters and things like that. I don't know. It was very. I just found that really hard. When I didn't recognize what was going on, I think it's really hard to know.
Delphini was, of course, also an extraordinary poet. So he's another example of one of these writer poets.
It is kind of,
that's
it's just very compressed.
Yeah, very compressed.
I think that's really difficult to translate.
And he's also someone who really fell between the cracks. Like, he didn't fit into any movement, because the Italians always liked in the post-war period to talk about this movement or this ism or that ism. They like to, in terms of the formation of the canon and the writing of literary history, I think. There were all sorts of people that are hard to fit in. I'm sort of reminded when you were talking about women that oftentimes students will ask me, oh, I want to translate an Italian women writer. I said, there's thousands of them. And it's like, how do you find them? And you're never going to find them in the history books,
Yeah. Well, you'll find some of them in this.
But you'll find them here, for example. That brings me to like Alba de Cespedes, who was a great discovery through this project. I mean, I keep raving to all of my Italian friends about her. And she was Cuban, Italian, and wrote this one short story, one that I translated, called Invitation to Dinner, which just captures in 5 pages the humiliation of Italians in the post-war period, in the immediate post-war period of Rome. And I think that was hard to translate in the sense that I had such an emotional connection to the story that I didn't know if I was technically able to do it. In everything that I've ever translated, though, there's always like one word on the first page that I will never be satisfied with. I don't know. I'll change it 100 times, and there is this word amareggiare or amareggiato, and I know what it means, and it just doesn't sound right in English to be embittered. But the Italians often will refer to emotions in terms of some kind of taste or other, even like when you say dolce, sweet. You're not necessarily talking about what is on your tongue. It could be many, many different things, but they're sort of using these sensory expressions to describe various emotional states. And I don't know what I settled for in the end. It's there. I remember William Weaver, the great translator, once said, once you've finished the translation and it's published, don't look at it again,
I don't know. I find translation, though, when you're reading something for the first time and it seems sort of deceptively simple, and then you think, okay, I'm going to go in there and this is going to be easy. But you get in and it's just very hard right from the beginning. I don't ever find a translation easier than another. I find them, each one has its own. So the thing I found most difficult, actually, was translating short stories one right after the other. Because when you're translating a novel, you kind of have time to get into the voice and start really hearing it and then going back over it and finding that voice again and again until it just sings and feels right. Whereas translating, going from one very distinct voice to the next, it was hard for me to really hear it in the way that I wanted to.
And there's a risk of imposing your own voice, which I was saying earlier, when we revise and revise and revise until it sounds right. But it sounds right because maybe it sounds like something that we might say. I mean, there's that risk. I mean, so you sort of try to be formal enough, and you do that very well. I've noticed in your translation, you really stick to the original.
Very literal-minded.
Yeah, but I mean, it really is a way of sort of avoiding the danger of imposing your voice. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any questions for me?
Tons. I mean, first of all, I usually don't like anthologies, I have to say. I mean, because it makes me think of school. And I used to want to read books and not excerpts. But this is really different, I mean, because there is an apparatus, I mean, in the sense that there is little biographies, but it's very personal, and I like that, And the fact that you organize it in the way that you did, just kind of, okay, this is going to be the category. The fact that you started with the South, which is actually the way that the Italian language developed. It begins in Sicily, so it's so appropriate that you began with Vittorini, because Italian courtly poetry began at the court of Frederick II in early 13th century. So in terms of coming up with this organizational principle, is it random? Was it to avoid too didactic an approach? Like to say, this isn't a history book, this isn't just for school. I mean, what was guiding you, I guess, in that direction?
It was because I wanted this book to exist. It was just, that was the motivating force was, to have these stories sotto mano, for in class, just put it down on the table and open it up and be able to refer to these authors. There were two previous anthologies in Italian that were very much models for me, one at the beginning and one toward the end. The one at the beginning was Vittorini's Americana. Vittorini is the first author to appear in the collection. He was a Sicilian author and translator and editor, among other things. And he created a landmark anthology of 33 American writers translated into Italian in a time when translation was dangerous activity in Italy. It was in the years of fascism, and the first incarnation of his book actually was not passed by the censors. He put these authors together, Hawthorne, Melville, Steinbeck, and introduced them to Italian readers and opened the floodgates to a new way of thinking about literature, a new way of thinking about everything, and left. It was a book that shaped a generation, and not only one generation, but I think really just was a sea change. A book that had enormous influence. I know this from conversations with my Italian editor, Luigi Brioschi, my editor at Guanda. We've had long conversations about the impact of Vittorini's volume on him personally, as a young man, as a writer, as a translator, in his times, in the 60s and 70s. So I was really actually very pleased that Vittorini comes first, because in some sense my anthology is a way of saluting his work, which was so courageous, such a courageous act to put that collection together and to publish it.
Omnibus? Was that what it was called?
Americana.
Americana.
The other collection that sort of is the other supporting pillar and influence of this work would be the anthology that Primo Levi puts together, A Search for Roots, it's called in English. And I actually cite his, I cite something from that anthology as the epigraph of my introduction. I have it in Italian. This is actually the Italian version of the anthology, which came out in the spring, but I'll read it to you in English. Always inclined to a hybrid input, I accepted willingly and with curiosity the proposal to compile a personal anthology, not in the Borgesian sense of an auto-anthology, but in that of a harvesting retrospectively and in good faith. This is from La ricerca delle radici, The Search for Roots by Primo Levi. What he's talking about the Borgesian auto-anthology is Borges assembled an anthology of his own writings, which is, of course, wonderful and fascinating in its own way. But what Primo Levi did was create an anthology, and I find this so incredible and moving. I mean, Primo Levi was one of the greatest, most well-read people, I think, on earth. Just if you read him, you'll understand what an incredibly well-read human being he was, and how deeply he loved literature of all kinds in so many languages, and from so many different traditions. And that love, that thirst, that deep thirst of literature fed his writing and made him the great writer that he was. But he, at one point, basically, he kept his very, very favorite books on one shelf together. And they were books that he kept, he would always refer to, that he was always consulting, that he loved the most. And he put those, he created an anthology out of excerpts from those books. And it's an amazing collection. So eclectic, so varied, so sort of breaking all the rules. There are scientific articles, there are You know, there's just such an incredible range of voices, and his curatorial eye. And of course, I think he meant for the book to be very personal. I mean, it's, you know,
I think that actually Einaudi asked a bunch of authors
to do this project.
Yes,
right.
And only Simon Levy did it.
And it fit his personality, I think, so perfectly.
But it's like you having, you know, somebody asking you to do the thing you wanted to do.
Right.
So, yeah.
I don't know. Okay, I think yes. All right, this is the microphone time. So, are there any questions for any of us from the audience?
Two, if you don't mind. Sorry about that. Two, if you don't mind. Firstly, a translation question. We hear a lot about sort of the formal differences between the short story and the novel. Yeah, from writers, from literary theorists. Yeah, short story is just not a short novel. And I'm wondering, from the perspective of translation, if there are sort of formal differences in the way that you approach a translation when you're translating a short work, a short story. And then I guess for you, Jhumpa, the question you mentioned earlier, you can't put your finger down on any one of these writers in this collection without sort of indicating a writer who's also a translator, or also an editor, or also a poet. In a very general sense, what do you think that contributed to the literature of the 20th century in Italy?
I'll answer that question, and maybe one of you can answer the translation, the short story novel question. I think that this hybrid perspective, if you will, and a hybrid, you know, activity of so many of these authors, their willingness to shift all over the place, whether shifting in terms of their own styles, their literary style, shifting across genre, shifting in terms of being in a chemistry lab and working in a, you know, paint varnish company, and then also writing, or being a diplomat and then also writing, or being a journalist, doing radio broadcasts in Cairo, and also writing. So they had sort of vital lives outside of the literary realm, outside of the work of being a writer, and the sort of, you know, frankly, the way when I became a writer, it seemed that there was already sort of this model of, okay, if you want to be a writer, you do this, and you study these things, and then you do this, and then you publish these things, and you live this kind of life. And I did live that kind of life, and enjoyed many things about that kind of life. But then when I went to Rome, and I started reading these authors and learning about their lives, I realized there were so many more ways to be a writer. And that really excited me and inspired me and made me think about what it meant to be a writer, and how one could call oneself a writer and call oneself other things, and how those other things, those other activities, those other pursuits could become a fundamental part of your work, and how things could feed. So, for example, Lalla Romano begins her life as a painter. I've been to her house. She's, you know, one sees her paintings everywhere. And then she was a translator, actually. She translated Flaubert. And it was the act of translating Flaubert's Three Tales that sort of launches her into the writing of fiction. So you see the sort of lineage, the way that the fiction arrives, you know, or even someone like Pavese, whose writing of short fiction comes later, after his work as a translator, after his work as a poet, and then he writes his fervent activity as a short story writer comes after all of these things. And these are just examples of people who are sort of artistically inclined and have talents in other disciplines and other art forms. But then then of course I think the biggest example is someone like Levy, you know, who's trained as a chemist and then becomes one of the greatest writers ever. and how, how his chemistry and his literary imagination are fused, how there's this sort of incredible alchemical experience of how the chemistry infuses the writing and the writing, So I just felt that it opened up my mind personally in terms of what it meant to be a writer. And I wanted to celebrate this type of more across sort of transversal approach to being a writer, to being an artist.
So I'll speak to I think the short story form is really one of the most difficult forms, and because a lot has to happen in a very small space, and each sentence has to accomplish a whole lot. And Jhumpa has said it's closer to poetry than it is to the novel, and I think that's really true. So I find translating short stories actually really difficult, more difficult than a novel, in the sense that you just don't have the time and space, and you're really trying to replicate this difficulty that that the author put into it. So I feel that tension in translating short stories, that it's just got a heavier. Each word, line, everything has more of a.
Yeah, I feel the opposite. Also because, in addition to working as a translator, I work as a simultaneous interpreter, where you have to just do everything right away, and I like, but when you're interpreting and then someone quotes poetry or prose, suddenly your mind just goes blank. I mean, you realize that language is used so very differently in a literary work, in such a deliberate way, and deployed just in such a clever way or surprising way. So it makes it impossible to do it. But I do like the idea of doing a short story in a single sitting. Yes, I'll go back and change things, but somehow maybe that is closer to my idea of art as well, or what the Italians call sprezzatura. This idea of something being done. Making everything look easy,
But it's never easy.
It's never easy, but never let them see you sweat,
Right.
Two more questions.
How does author identity inform how you translate? And if you could also speak to how, when you don't really have a full picture of author identity, in the case of Ferrante, how does that inform how you translate?
I mean, in the case of Ferrante, I don't think, as Jenny was saying, sometimes a dead author is easier than a live one. It's really the voice of the writing rather than the author, him or herself, that's important, I think. And that's the thing that you get involved with. Again, in the case of Ferrante, the first person narrator, at least for me, makes it easier to get to channel, so to speak, channel the writer. To channel the voice. If it's the first person, you're writing as an I, and so you sort of in some way become that I, at least to an extent. Of course, you then have to step away and say, well, actually,
I have to feed the dog now.
It's not me, right? But
well, especially with Primo Levi. We both worked on Primo Levi.
we all did.
All three of you have translated.
Yeah, really.
All three of
And
these translators have translated.
I worked on The Drowned and the Saved, and he was deeply depressed when he was writing this, and it was very hard to do more than a few lines a day.
Right.
Absolutely true. Every time you translate, you do, Jhumpa has used the word channel, but you do become the author in some level. And becoming Primo Levi was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, for sure. And I found it very exhausting and sad. And even when I was translating his wonderful stories that were sort of science fiction and kind of lighter and funnier, still there was this level of
undertow,
of deep darkness.
Okay, one more question.
I'm curious, Jhumpa, you were talking about how obviously this collection, and we're talking about that it was translated into English in this case tonight. But the fact you mentioned it's been published in Italian as well, this collection in English brings Italian writing to English-speaking readers. What do you hope it will bring to Italian readers?
Well, I've seen what it's brought to Italian readers, and it's been very gratifying. I mean, first of all, I have yet to show the back of this book to anybody in Italy, anyone I know in Italy, and I do know a lot of people at this point in Italy, and there's always one author, and even among the most sort of well-read of my friends and acquaintances, there's always one, and someone will say, "Oh, well, I don't really remember reading the work of so and so." So this is exciting for me to see how, my project, someone who's not Italian, who did not grow up in Italy, who's come to know the culture and the literature, at a later stage in my life. So coming very much, stepping in from the outside, stepping in at a later point in my life. The fact that Italians have been so curious to know how I've perceived this landscape.
What's really interesting and surprising as well about this anthology is that even the very well-known authors, you found stories that are surprising to me.
Well, I made a point of that, right?
Yeah,
so I knew that with Moravia, with Morante, with Calvino, with some of the other authors, that I wanted to show another side of those authors. So, for example, the story that Michael translated by Moravia is called L'altra faccia della luna, the other side of the moon. And it really is the other face of the moon, and it really is sort of this could be the subtext of the entire anthology, because I'm trying to always show that other side. So I think for the Italian reader, and this is what I gathered because I was living in Italy this past year when this volume was published in May, and I did many presentations for it, and everyone who talked to me about it, who engaged with me about the book, remarked on the fact that they were seeing themselves in a new light. And I think that is always the case when the outsider steps in and tries to describe things, and that is why it's so important, I believe, for outsiders to step in to any situation and observe and absorb and then reflect back. And it's only from those outside voices and perspectives that we gain perspective on ourselves. So I was very grateful that my Italian editor was enthusiastic about publishing this volume. It was an enormous amount of work on top of the already enormous amount of work of putting together the version in English. All of the stories, of course, sort of returned home into Italian, but that all of my curatorial, critical apparatus, I translated it into Italian out of English, and I also added, this volume has a separate avvertenza. It's a sort of a few pages just to explain to the Italian author why this book has been converted back into Italian, and the point of that. And my point in writing this text was to say that I wanted to open up the idea of what an Italian reader even was. Because when we first decided to publish this volume in Italian, there were actually a lot of people who said, I don't know how people are going to react here. You're not Italian. What do you have to say about their literature? It might be interesting for people over in America or in England, but we in Italy, we have our people. We have lots of literary critics. We know what we're about. And I said, well, I think I still have something to contribute. And then they said, well, okay, let's do the book, but don't over-explain things to an Italian, because we know things, okay? Like, we know what Rai is, and we don't need these footnotes and things like that. And it got me thinking deeply about what it is, who is an Italian reader in the end. This whole question, the book is teeming with questions about identity. And as an editor, the last question I considered was the identity of an Italian reader. Because the assumption is an Italian reader is Italian. But the reality is that that's simply not the case. We are all Italian readers. We are not Italian, but we all love and read Italian literature. My students at Princeton who read Italian are Italian readers. They can read this book just as well as that book. So what makes an Italian reader is simply the knowledge of being able to read Italian. So I wanted this book to be for that Italian reader. So what I said in this book, in the beginning of this book, and if you read Italian, if you read that avvertenza that I wrote, I make the case that the Italian reader is not this narrow band of people who live in Italy or have Italian passports or have Italian blood coursing through their veins, whatever that may even mean. What the Italian reader is anybody who has the ability to read and to appreciate this language, and that includes people of, children of Italians who are raised in families all over the world, whether it's in Brooklyn, whether it's in Australia, people like me who have parents who come from another part of the world who are connected to a culture but don't necessarily have access to that culture. They actually do need the footnotes. They might not know what raitre is. So that was my intention in making this book. The final intention in creating this Italian version was to just break open that idea of the Italian reader and to make the point that anyone can be or become an Italian reader.
Let's give them a hand.